The paper in his hand cost $1. One single dollar for 1,000 acres of nothing and a house forgotten by time. At least that's what it was supposed to be. Wyatt McGraw clutched the deed, the wind trying to rip it from his grasp. The ranch was supposed to be abandoned, forsaken, empty. The seller in town had practically shoved the paper at him, his eyes wide with something that looked a lot like fear. He'd taken Wyatt's dollar like it was burning his fingers. But the seller was a liar, because as Wyatt crested the last rise, he saw it, a thin ribbon of smoke, gray against the pale blue sky, curling from the stone chimney of the old wooden house. It danced in the air like a secret he wasn't supposed to see. This was his escape, his sanctuary from a world that had left him with nothing but scars and the dust on his boots. He'd ridden for 3 days into the heart of nowhere, seeking a silence so deep it could heal a man's soul. Instead, he found a ghost, a sign of life where none should exist. He urged his horse forward, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol. The silence of the prairie was a living thing, broken only by the crunch of dry grass under his horse's hooves. As he got closer, the signs became clearer. The rocking chair on the porch wasn't just old. It was moving, swaying gently in a breeze that didn't seem to touch anything else. And then he heard it, a sound that made the hairs on his arms stand up. Laughter. It wasn't the wind. It was soft, feminine, drifting from the house like a melody from a dream. More than one voice. 3, maybe 4. They were talking, their words too muffled to make out. But the sound was real. It was warm. It was alive. This wasn't an abandoned ranch. This was a mystery. He swung down from his horse, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. A line of fresh laundry fluttered between 2 porch posts, the clothes still damp, smelling of soap and sun. Everything about this place screamed that it was a home, but the deed in his hand, stamped with the seal of the territory, said it was his. Empty, unclaimed. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to keep this place a secret. The seller hadn't just been nervous. He'd been terrified. He'd sworn on his mother's grave that the place was cursed, that the isolation had driven every last soul away until the bank gave up. Now, standing at the foot of the porch, Wyatt knew he'd bought more than land. He'd bought a secret. The front door was cracked open just enough to let a sliver of lamplight spill out onto the dusty porch boards. He wasn't just a landowner, he was an intruder. The question wasn't if he should knock, it was whether he'd live to regret it. He took a step onto the porch, the old wood groaning under his weight. The laughter inside stopped. Instantly, the silence that fell was heavier, more threatening than the empty prairie had ever been. He knew they'd heard him. He knew they were listening. And then, the door swung open. The woman standing there wasn't a ghost. She was flesh and blood, with auburn hair pulled back from a face that was a mix of grit and fear. Her green eyes widened when she saw him, a stranger in travel-worn clothes with a saddlebag over his shoulder and a gun on his hip. She looked as startled to see him as he was to see her. "You're lost," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was steady, but he saw the slight tremor in her hand as she gripped the doorframe. "There's nothing out here but broken promises." Wyatt didn't smile. He just held up the crumpled deed. The paper rustled, the only sound in the tense quiet. "Actually, ma'am, I think I'm right where I'm supposed to be." He let his words hang in the air. "According to this land is mine. I bought it, fair and square." He watched her face, looking for a flicker of guilt, a hint of deception. All he saw was a flash of panic, quickly masked by confusion. She took a step back, pulling the door closer. That's not possible. This place hasn't been owned in years. We've been—" She cut herself off, biting her lip. She'd already said too much. "We—" The word echoed the laughter he'd heard. Wyatt took a deliberate step onto the porch, his spurs making a soft metallic sound. "We? How many of you are living in my house?" From the shadows inside, he heard the scuff of a boot, a hushed whisper. The woman, this Eliza May, as he'd later learn her name was, glanced over her shoulder before her eyes snapped back to his. Her expression was a mix of desperation and pure, unyielding defiance. "My name is Eliza," she said. her voice stronger now. And we are not squatters if that's what you're thinking. We have a right to be here. A right based on what? Wyatt kept his tone level, but his patience, worn thin by 3 days on the trail, was starting to fray. He'd come for solitude, not a standoff. Eliza lifted her chin. She wasn't tall, but she stood like she was. Based on survival, based on the fact that the law and what's right don't always ride the same trail. Behind her, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness of the room. A tall woman with dark hair and a regal posture. Then another, a fiery redhead with her arms crossed. He saw glimpses of others, feminine shapes moving just out of sight. Eliza wasn't lying. This house was full. He'd stumbled into something far bigger than a simple property dispute. These women weren't just living here. They were holding a fortress. Look, Wyatt said, trying a different tack. He took off his hat, a gesture of peace. I don't want any trouble, but I paid for this land. It's all I've got. He looked at Eliza, trying to read the story in her tired eyes. Maybe we can work something out. Her expression softened, just a fraction. The hard defiance gave way to a deep weariness. You'd better come inside, she said, her voice low. She opened the door wider. But I'm warning you, once you cross this threshold, the simple life you thought you were buying is gone forever. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He stepped over the threshold, and the world he knew vanished behind him. The inside of the house was not the dusty, cobweb-filled shack of an abandoned ranch. It was a home. It was warm, clean, and filled with the scent of baking bread and dried herbs. Hand-sewn curtains covered the windows. A well-used rifle was propped carefully by the hearth. This wasn't a temporary shelter. This was a sanctuary, built by hands that had no intention of ever letting it go. 4 other women now stood with Eliza, forming a silent, watchful line. They were all different, yet they stood together with the unity of a wolf pack. The tall, dark-haired one, Evelyn, looked at him like a queen studying a peasant. The redhead, Rebecca, had a gaze so direct it felt like she was reading his soul. A small, blonde woman named Grace had eyes that darted everywhere, taking in every detail. And behind them all stood the youngest, Daisy, a girl with brown hair who looked at him with the terror of a cornered fawn. This is Wyatt McGraw, Eliza announced to the tense room. He says he owns our home. Evelyn stepped forward. I don't care about your paper, mister. We reclaimed this place from the dust. We planted crops. We mended the fences. We made it live again. We're not leaving. 5 determined women, Rebecca added, her voice sharp as a razor, can make life real difficult for one stubborn man. Wyatt put his saddlebag on the floor. He was tired, he was hungry, and he was standing in the middle of a powder keg. I understand you've made a home here. I respect that. He looked from one face to the next. But that doesn't answer the real question. What were you all running from that led you to the most forgotten place on the map? A lightning-fast glance passed between the women. A shared secret, heavy and dark. He'd asked the one question they never wanted to answer. Evelyn's composure cracked. Grace wrung her hands. It was Eliza who finally broke the silence, her words dropping like stones into a deep well. The same thing you are, I imagine, she said softly. Trouble. She looked him dead in the eye. The difference is, we found each other, and we won't let anyone tear that apart. Wyatt saw the fear behind their bravery. The way they stood shoulder to shoulder wasn't just for solidarity, it was for protection. These weren't just settlers. They were fugitives. I'm not here to cause you harm, he said, keeping his voice calm. But if trouble is following you, it's following me now too. I need to know what I've walked into. Evelyn stared out the window, into the endless prairie, as if expecting to see demons riding out of the dusk. Some secrets are better left buried, mister, for your own good. Not when they're buried on my land, Wyatt shot back. Rebecca gave a short, bitter laugh. Trouble isn't what's following us. Trouble is what we left behind. This place, this is our escape from men who believe they own a woman's soul. The youngest, Daisy, who hadn't spoken a word, suddenly stepped forward. Her voice was a bare whisper, but it cut through the room like a knife. They said they'd always find us, she breathed, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it made Wyatt's blood run cold. They said there was nowhere on God's earth we could hide. The confession hung in the air. thick and suffocating. These women weren't just running from bad memories. They were being hunted. "Who is they?" Wyatt asked, though a part of him already knew he didn't want the answer. Before anyone could speak, Grace, who had been watching the window, let out a tiny gasp. "Riders," she whispered, her face pale. "Riders are coming." And just like that, the powder keg had been lit. The word riders changed everything. The fear in the room didn't disappear, it transformed. It sharpened into a cold, grim resolve. These women moved with the terrifying efficiency of soldiers who had drilled for this moment 100 times. Evelyn was the first to act. She snatched the rifle from its place by the hearth, her movements fluid and sure. Rebecca vanished into a back room and reappeared a second later, a double-barreled shotgun in her hands and a bandolier of shells slung over her shoulder. Grace moved through the room like a phantom, extinguishing the lamps one by one, plunging the house into a dim, shadowy twilight. Only the faint glow from the fireplace remained, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Daisy, the youngest, the one who seemed so fragile, was already at the window, peering through a tiny gap in the curtains. Her body was tense, but her voice when she spoke was shockingly steady. "Three of them," she reported, her whisper carrying across the room. "They're circling the house, taking their time." Eliza turned to Wyatt, and the woman who had greeted him with nervous fear was gone. In her place was a commander, her green eyes as hard and cold as riverstones. "This is it," she said, her voice low and urgent. "This is your one chance to walk away, McGraw. Go out the back. Get on your horse and ride. Ride hard and don't look back. Forget you ever saw this place. Forget you ever saw us." Wyatt felt the familiar, comforting weight of the Colt on his hip. He'd lived his life by that gun, and it had kept him alive when nothing else would. Walking away was the smart play, the sane play. These weren't his ghosts to fight. "How often does this happen?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Fourth time in 2 years," Rebecca answered without looking at him, her thumbs expertly checking the shells in her shotgun. "They get closer every time." Through the window, Wyatt could see them now. Three dark shapes on horseback, moving slowly, methodically, like sharks circling their prey. They weren't in a hurry. They were confident. They knew what was inside. A voice called out from the darkness, a man's voice laced with an arrogant cruelty that curdled the blood. "Ladies, we know you're in there. Your little game of hide-and-seek is over." Daisy flinched at the sound of his voice, a choked sob escaping her lips. "It's him," she whispered, her hands gripping the windowsill so hard her knuckles were white. "It's really him." The man outside laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "You can come out now and we can be civil about this. Or we can burn this shack to the ground with you in it. Either way, you're coming home with us tonight." Home. The word was a profanity. Wyatt looked at the five women, their faces grim in the flickering firelight. He looked at Eliza's set jaw, at Rebecca's steady hands on her shotgun, at Evelyn's defiant posture. He saw the terror in Daisy's eyes, but he also saw a flicker of something else, a will to fight. He could leave. He could save himself and ride into the sunset, leaving them to their fate. That was the smart thing to do. But as he looked at their faces, he knew he wasn't going anywhere. He'd spent years running from his own past, searching for a piece of land to call his own. Maybe this was it. Maybe a home wasn't just about dirt and wood. Maybe it was about the people you were willing to stand with when the world came to burn it all down. The choice was made for him in the next instant. With a sound like a thunderclap, the front door exploded inward, ripped from its hinges, showering the room in a spray of splintered wood. The fight for the $1 ranch had begun. The first man through the shattered doorway was a mountain. He was built like a bear, with shoulders so wide he had to turn to fit through the frame. His eyes, small and cruel, scanned the darkened room and then locked onto Daisy. A disgusting, predatory grin split his face. "There she is," he growled, his voice a low rumble of satisfaction. "There's our pretty little runaway. You really think you could hide from me forever, darling?" Before the man could take another step, Wyatt moved. He put himself directly between the brute and the women, a solid wall of quiet menace. "This is my property," Wyatt said, his voice dangerously calm. "You're trespassing." The man's grin vanished, replaced by a look of pure annoyance. "And who the hell are you?" I'm the man who owns this ranch, Wyatt said, his hand now resting on the grip of his Colt. And I'm the man telling you to get out. A second man slithered through the doorway behind the first. This one was lean and wiry, like a snake, and he moved with the cold, deadly confidence of a hired killer. Marcus, we don't have time for this, the snake said. Just grab the girls and let's go. From the line of women, there was a metallic click. Rebecca had cocked both hammers on her shotgun. The sound was deafening in the silence. You're not taking anyone anywhere, you animals, she spat. The big man, Marcus, let out a harsh laugh. Always the feisty one, weren't you, Rebecca? That's half the fun. His eyes roamed over each woman, a cattleman appraising his stock. You have any idea how much trouble you've caused? How much money you've cost us? Money? Eliza's voice was sharp with contempt. Is that all this is about to you? Everything's about money, sweetheart, Marcus sneered. You girls were an investment, and it's time for our investment to start paying off. Then the third rider appeared in the doorway, and Wyatt knew this was the one they should truly fear. He wasn't big like Marcus or shifty like the second man. He was dressed in a fine city coat and carried himself with an air of educated authority, but his eyes were as cold and dead as a winter sky. He was the leader. He removed his hat with a gesture of mock politeness. Ladies, he said, his voice smooth and cultured, but with an underlying current of absolute venom. Gentlemen, let's not be hasty. I'm Samuel Morrison, and I'm sure we can come to an arrangement that benefits everyone. Daisy let out a whimper and shrank back against the wall, trying to make herself invisible. No, she whispered. Please, I won't go back. Morrison's gaze fell on her, and his lips curved into a smile that held no warmth at all. Oh, but you will, my dear Daisy. You all will. He took a step into the room, his eyes sweeping over the defiant women and the man who stood with them. You see, you have something that belongs to me, and I always, always collect what's mine. Wyatt felt the world narrow to this one room, the scent of gunpowder and fear, the defiant set of Eliza's jaw, the tremor in Daisy's hands. These weren't just bounty hunters. They were monsters. They don't belong to anyone, Wyatt said, and with one smooth, practiced motion, he drew his Colt. The barrel was rock steady, aimed directly at Morrison's heart. Morrison's smile didn't falter. In fact, it widened. He looked at Wyatt's gun, then back at his face, and his eyes glittered with a dark, chilling amusement. Ah, he said softly, the righteous hero, how delightfully predictable. He didn't seem afraid. He seemed pleased. And in that moment, Wyatt realized this wasn't a fight. It was a trap, and he had just walked right into the center of it. Morrison looked at Wyatt's drawn gun as if it were a minor inconvenience, a piece of cutlery laid at the wrong place setting. Tell me, Mr. McGraw, he said, his voice dripping with condescension, do you have any idea what you're actually defending here? I know I'm defending people against men like you, Wyatt said, his thumb resting on the hammer of his pistol. Morrison let out a soft chuckle. So noble, so simple. He took another casual step into the room, his men fanning out behind him, their positions cutting off any chance of escape. But you see, you've only heard one side of the story. Did these ladies happen to mention the money they stole? The contracts they broke? The good, trusting people whose lives they ruined when they fled like thieves in the night? That's a lie, Eliza shot back, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a hesitation. Is it? Morrison reached into his fine coat and produced a folded document. He held it up. This, Mr. McGraw, is a promissory note, signed by each of these women. In it, they agree to work to pay off a debt of $15,000, money that was generously advanced for their travel, their lodging, their food, money they took before they disappeared. Grace, the small blonde woman, went pale. Those contracts were fraudulent. We were forced to sign them. Perhaps, Morrison conceded with a dismissive wave of his hand. The law can be so messy. But theft is theft, is it not? And what you took was worth far more than $15,000. His eyes hardened, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You took my ledger. The room went deathly still. Wyatt could feel the weight of that one word. Ledger. This wasn't just about 5 runaway women. This was bigger, much bigger. You took the book, Morrison continued, his voice barely audible, but each word landing like a hammer blow. The one with the names, the locations, the financial records of every single girl I have ever placed. That ledger, ladies, is worth more than all of your insignificant lives combined. The pieces slammed into place in Wyatt's mind with sickening clarity. Morrison wasn't just a monster. He was a businessman. His business was human souls. He was a trafficker, and these women hadn't just escaped him. They had stolen the evidence that could burn his entire empire to the ground. The names in that book could bring down dozens of rich, powerful men across the entire territory. Marcus, the big man, took a threatening step toward Daisy. "Where is it?" he snarled. "We'll tear this whole place apart, board by board." Daisy shook her head, pressing herself against the wall. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, but you do, my dear," Morrison said softly, his eyes fixed on her. "You were always the clever one, the quiet one who watched everything. You understood that knowledge is the only real power." He then turned his chilling gaze back to the group. "So let's stop this foolishness. Give me my ledger, and perhaps I'll be merciful." Evelyn stepped in front of Daisy, a human shield. "And if we don't?" Morrison's smile was pure poison. "Because the ledger isn't just about my business, my dear Evelyn. It's about yours." He let the words sink in. "It also contains the real names and the last known locations of every girl who ever ran away from me. Girls who are right now trying to live quiet lives as school teachers, seamstresses, and wives. Girls who think they are safe." The threat was monstrous in its simplicity. The ledger wasn't just evidence, it was a hit list. It was a weapon he could use to find and destroy every single woman who had ever escaped his clutches. He wasn't just threatening these 5 women. He was threatening dozens more. Grace spoke, her voice shaking but defiant. "If anything happens to us, copies of that ledger go to every federal marshal and newspaper from here to the coast." Morrison actually clapped his hands together softly, a gesture of mock applause. "Excellent. I was hoping you'd say that. You see, I do so admire a well-laid plan." He reached into his coat again. This time he pulled out a gleaming brass pocket watch. He clicked it open. "Let's review the last few hours, shall we?" he said, staring at the watch face. 3 hours ago, my associates paid a visit to the editor of the Silver Creek Chronicle, a very cooperative man, once we explained the penalties for possessing stolen property." He looked up, his eyes glinting. "2 hours ago, they had a chat with your friend, Marshall Davidson in Copper Ridge. He was also surprisingly reasonable." Eliza's face had turned to stone. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Morrison's voice was silk and steel. "And 1 hour ago, they found that sweet school teacher, Martha, in Pine Hollow, the one who was so fond of helping lost girls find their way." Grace stumbled back as if she'd been struck. "No, not Martha. She would never—" "She would die first?" Morrison finished for her, his tone laced with false sympathy. "My dear child, why do you think it took my men an entire hour?" The unspoken horror of his words sucked the air from the room. The women's last line of defense, their carefully constructed safety net, had been systematically, brutally dismantled. Their enemy hadn't just found them, he had outmaneuvered them at every turn, isolating them completely. Their web of secrets was gone. Rebecca's shotgun trembled slightly in her grip. "The ledger itself," she rasped. "You still don't have it. You'll never find it." Morrison snapped his pocket watch shut. He smiled. "Actually," he said, glancing toward the back of the house, "my men should be just about finished with the root cellar." As if on cue, footsteps echoed from the rear of the cabin. A 4th man appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was holding a heavy, leather-bound book. "Found it, boss," the man said, a grin on his face. "Buried right under a sack of potatoes, just like you said." He tossed the book through the air. Morrison caught it with one hand. The ledger. Daisy let out a single broken sob. It was the sound of a soul breaking. All of their planning, all of their running, all of their courage. It had all been for nothing. "How?" she whispered, her voice hollow. "How did you know?" Morrison patted the cover of the ledger. Simple psychology, my dear. You may have learned to fight, but you never learned to think like a predator. He opened the book, his eyes scanning the pages with triumph. Desperate people are always so predictable. Wyatt watched as the last glimmer of hope died in the women's eyes. Their enemy hadn't just beaten them, he had crushed them. Morrison closed the ledger with a soft, final snap. He turned his full attention to Wyatt. "And now, Mr. McGraw," he said, his voice deadly serious, "you have a choice. The same one I gave the others. Walk away now. Forget everything you saw here tonight. Or you can stay, and you can die with them." From outside, another sound cut through the night. The sound of more horses, at least a dozen. They were approaching fast. Morrison smiled. The trap was closing. His reinforcements had arrived. It was all over. But the approaching hoofbeats weren't Morrison's men. As the sound grew to a thunderous roar, a strange thing happened. The look of utter despair on Daisy's face vanished. It was replaced by something else, a cold, hard fire. She straightened up from the wall, her chin lifting. "You made one mistake, Mr. Morrison," she said, and her voice was no longer the whisper of a frightened girl. It was clear, steady, and sharp as forged steel. "You assumed I was the one who needed protecting." Morrison's triumphant smile faltered. He stared at her, a flicker of uncertainty in his cold eyes. "What did you do?" "You were so busy tracking down our copies," Daisy said, taking a step forward. "You never wondered what the original plan was." The house was now surrounded. Shouts came from outside. "Throw down your weapons! You are surrounded by United States Marshals!" Morrison's face went white. He spun around, but it was too late. The shattered doorway and the windows were filled with armed men, their badges gleaming in the lantern light. They weren't local law. These were federal officers. "3 days ago," Daisy continued, her voice ringing with power, "I sent a telegram, not to a newspaper editor, not to a small-town marshal. I sent it to the territorial governor himself." Morrison looked from the marshals to Daisy, his mind reeling, unable to process his defeat. "I didn't send him copies of your ledger," she said, her eyes boring into his. "I sent him something much better. I sent him the names of every federal official on your payroll, the judges, the deputies, the politicians, and I sent him the bank records to prove it." A lead marshal, a man with a hard, honest face, stepped into the room, his pistol aimed at Morrison's chest. "Samuel Morrison, you are under arrest for human trafficking, bribery, conspiracy to commit murder." The list of charges went on and on. Morrison's men, Marcus and the others, were already dropping their guns, their hands shooting into the air. They were killers, but they weren't fools. Their empire had just crumbled into dust around them. "While you were destroying our insurance policy," Daisy said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "I was burning yours to the ground." Morrison's mask of civilized control finally shattered. He stared at Daisy, his face a twisted mess of rage and disbelief. "You stupid girl," he snarled. "You don't know what you've done. My organization protected those girls. Without me, they're nothing. They'll be defenseless." "No," Eliza said, stepping forward to stand beside Daisy, her voice filled with a strength that had been forged in fire. "They'll be free." She looked at Morrison, her eyes blazing. "And there's a difference." As the marshals dragged Morrison and his men away in chains, a strange quiet settled over the ranch house. The scent of splintered wood and gun smoke hung in the air, but the suffocating tension was gone. The battle was over. Wyatt stood in the middle of the room, his gun still in his hand, watching the 5 women. They weren't victims. They were survivors, warriors. He had stumbled into their war, and somehow they had won. He finally holstered his pistol and ran a hand through his hair. "Well," he said, his voice rough, "I guess now that you're safe, you'll be moving on." The women looked at each other. A silent conversation passed between them. But this time, the look they shared wasn't one of fear. It was one of hope. Evelyn, the tall, regal one, turned to him. "Actually," she said, a small smile touching her lips, "we were thinking this place is big enough, and it could probably use a man who isn't afraid to stand his ground when it counts." Rebecca nodded, leaning her shotgun against the wall. Someone who knows some things are worth fighting for, even if they're not your fight to begin with. Grace smiled, a real shy smile this time, and we could certainly use some help mending that door. Daisy, no longer the frightened girl but a young woman of incredible strength and cunning, stepped forward. Besides, she said, her eyes twinkling, you paid a whole dollar for this ranch. It would be a shame to let it go to waste. Finally, Eliza met his gaze. Her green eyes were clear and direct. We're offering you a partnership, Wyatt McGraw. Equal shares. In the land, in the work, and in whatever comes next. Wyatt looked around the room, at the wreckage and the warmth. He looked at the faces of these women who had built a home out of sheer will and courage. He had come here seeking solitude, a place to be alone. But standing here, in this house defended by warriors, he realized what he'd really been looking for was a place to belong. For the first time in a very long time, he felt like he was finally home. Well then, he said, a slow grin spreading across his face as he picked up a piece of the broken door. I suppose we'd better get to work. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale where courage and destiny collide in the untamed frontier. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.